let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike.
This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly.
Welcome. Our guest today is historian, author, and filmmaker Dr. Graham Peck. He is a Wepner Distinguished Professor of Lincoln Studies at the University of Illinois at Springfield. His work primarily focuses on the careers of Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas. He is a prolific author and lecturer. Dr. Peck wrote and directed a feature-length biographic film entitled Stephen A. Douglas and the Fate of American Democracy. Our discussion today will center on his award-winning book, Making an Antislavery Nation, Lincoln, Douglas, and the Battle over Freedom, which received the 2018 Russell P. Strange Memorial Book of the Year Award and was a finalist for the 2018 Gildan Lehrman Lincoln Prize. Welcome, Dr. Peck.
Thank you very much, Rob. It's a pleasure to speak with you.
Well, it's tradition here, Dr. Peck, to accompany the conversation with a special brew. Today, since we have a classic topic, we have the classic American-style lager Pabst Blue Ribbon, which was brewed for the last 175 years. Affectionately known as PBR, the company claims the beer got its famous name following its win as America's Best at the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893. Now, Dr. Peck, there's no clear proof that any such award was given at that exposition, but it didn't stop Captain Pabst from putting a blue silk ribbon on individual bottles of his beer. It was costly at the time, but it proved to be marketing genius as patrons began asking for the blue ribbon beer, and it earned its famous name. After its peak in the late 1970s, it began a very steep decline, and in 1996, the brand was virtually out of production. But due to its popularity with urban hipsters, PBR is once again fashionable. Our featured beer today is Pabst Blue Ribbon. And remember to subscribe to the History A Go-Go podcast, like our Facebook page, and leave a suggestion for a future feature beer. If yours is chosen, you'll win a $10 gift card from Hy-Vee. So subscribe and review the podcast. Thank you. So, Dr. Peck, you've spent most of your life researching the politics surrounding slavery in America. Abraham Lincoln gave a famous speech in Peoria in, I believe, 1854, and he challenged the Kansas Nebraska Act. He dedicated part of that speech to the importance of the Compromise of 1820, also known as the Missouri Compromise. What happened leading up to the Compromise of 1820, and why was it so important for Republican politicians like Lincoln to maintain the agreements in that compromise?
Well, the Compromise of 1820 was a byproduct of the attempt of two states, Maine and Missouri, to enter the Union. And Congress had to approve new states coming into the Union. And those two states ended up coming into an interesting situation because anti-slavery restrictionists, as they were known, Northern congressmen, many from the Jeffersonian Republican Party, but also many Federalists, the remnants of the Federalists, I should say, combined to try to block the entry of a slave state, arguing that the founders had intended the country to become free and that Southerners had to stop adding slave states if that vision of a free country was ever to come to pass. Southern congressmen were really, really resistant to this concept. And what emerged was a serious catfight on the floors of Congress. There was no direct violence, but what happened was Southerners allied to vote for Missouri to come into the Union without restrictions, with its pro-slavery constitution sent up from the territory, and the Northern congressmen allying together across the parties to try to block its admission. Ultimately, Missouri comes into the Union in the Compromise of 1820 paired with Maine. So both states come in at the same time, the idea being to keep the votes in the Senate balanced between free and slave states. And this was considered a huge pro-slavery victory because the Northern restrictionists had blocked Missouri's entry into the Union for over a year. And so the compromise had succeeded in overcoming that resistance. However, there was a catch to the pro-slavery success. And that catch was that an Illinois senator, Jesse B. Thomas, proposed an amendment to the admission of Missouri, and that was that all future territory above 36 degrees 30 in the Louisiana territory, which was enormous, it stretched all the way west to the Rocky Mountains, up north to the Canadian border, and included maybe 8 to 10 more Missouris in it. That all of that remaining territory would forever be free. And so it was under that stipulation that the Northerners agreed to admitting this one additional slave state. So if we fast forward 30 years, we can see why Abraham Lincoln and other anti-slavery politicians were very, very angry with the Kansas Nebraska Act in 1854, which effectively struck down that anti-slavery provision in the Missouri Compromise because it opened this enormous territory to slavery. And as Lincoln said, the South has already eaten its half of the loaf from that compromise. Now, just as we're about to start eating our half, as free soil settlers are about to start entering this vast territory, they're grabbing our loaf and stuffing it into their mouth. So he felt that not only was it a gross betrayal of trust, but also it was an indication that the Southerners were never going to stop adding slave states and that they were losing the founders' commitment to eventually creating a truly free country.
So this expansion of territory, manifest destiny, was that accepted by both, at that time, by both the Whigs and the Democrats? Was that universally accepted, the idea of manifest destiny and territorial expansion?
So let's skip back down one decade to the 1840s, because that's when the language of manifest destiny was by far the most common. And the idea of manifest destiny was linked to American nationalism, that this country had a destiny, through the hand of Providence or God, to overtake the entire continent. The entire North American continent would be a land of freedom as American institutions spread over it. And to accomplish that, Americans had to acquire that territory by hook or by crook. And Northern Democrats were distinctly more affiliated with this concept than were Northern Whigs. Whigs and Democrats were the two major parties of the era. And the phrase itself was coined by a Northern Democratic newspaper editor, John Sullivan. And the language became part of the lexicon of Northern Democratic politics, articulated by many, many Democratic politicians, including Stephen A. Douglas. So it was primarily a Democratic policy. That being said, of course, America had been expansionist since the colonial era, even if it hadn't been done through national or even colonial or state policies. It had been done simply by the fact that the birth rate was so high and the immigration rates were high, that settlers were constantly moving west for hundreds of years. And that inexorable, it seemed, movement across land led to land cessions by Indians, often both by hook and by crook. So manifest destiny was, in that sense, nothing new, but it was new insofar as it was articulating a specific understanding of American nationalism in the mid-19th century.
So the war with Mexico, you mentioned the Louisiana Purchase territory and eventually that compromise in 1820, and most of that land is going to be free because it's above that 36-30 line. But after the war with Mexico, all of that land, there's huge swaths of that to Southerners could have been slave territory. Is that correct?
Yes. So you're absolutely correct. Under President Polk, who was an ardent expansionist like Stephen A. Douglas, the country embarked on a foreign war with Mexico, Polk compromised a potential issue in the Northwest Territories with Oregon, but he did not compromise with Mexico, a much, much weaker power. And he, in fact, precipitated a war by sending American troops to a disputed boundary with Mexico. And once the war broke out, he was eager to conquer Mexico and to extract land concessions, which then raised the question of whether that land would be slave or free. Southern congressmen absolutely believed that the land should be open to slaveholders, and their perceptions are entirely understandable because Southern soldiers or Southern-born Americans were fighting in the American Army. So why should Southern blood be spilled and then Southern institutions be banned from the territory acquired by the valor of Southern arms?
Dr.
So
Peck,
that was distinctly the position of the Southerners.
Can I, in dealing with the war with Mexico, maybe you can help me out here. Are the majority of the officers in the Army and the preponderance of the soldiers coming from the South?
That is probably true. I'm not entirely certain. I believe that was the case. States like Illinois, though, Illinois gave a huge number of troops to that conflict. It was immensely popular. So it was by no means purely a Southern-dominated war. That would be misunderstanding the thrust of Northern democratic nationalism. So there was a great deal of support for American expansion, regardless of who had the most number of officers.
Okay. But there is a desire by the South, as you mentioned, to add territory to the United States, and Douglas shares that view.
Absolutely.
And
in fact, the Southerners proposed in the 1850s to expand into Central America.
Right.
They wanted Caribbean territories like Cuba, and Douglas was willing to promote the acquisition of those territories, both because he wanted them and because he wanted to satisfy Southerners who were threatening disunion at different points during the 1850s.
So the war with Mexico leads to a huge addition of land to the country. And eventually, California is going to petition to enter the Union. Can you tell us how California enters the Union and what compromises are needed to be made because it petitions to enter as a free state?
That's correct. So the Compromise of 1850, like the Compromise of 1820, illustrated the problem of slavery expansion in national politics. The Southerners were not eager to have a free state enter without a corresponding slave state, and they tried to block California's admission. And they were quite successful in this regard. The Compromise of 1850 was a 10-month, quite bitter conflict in Congress, and it was only adjudicated after exhaustive efforts by advocates of compromise who were afraid of disunion, because some Southerners were discoursing on disunion and suggesting that if the North was pushing its anti-slavery ideas and trying to exclude Southerners from the territories acquired from Mexico, which many Northerners were indeed attempting to do, then the Southerners would break apart the Union. So the compromise that eventually is produced, with Stephen A. Douglas being probably the leading player in that process, was that the fugitive slave law would be strengthened so that it would be more difficult for Northerners to help escaped slaves, find their way into Canada or into anti-slavery havens in the North. So Southerners wanted that. They wanted constitutional guarantees of their slave property to be maintained by the North. Correspondingly, Northerners demanded that the slave trade in Washington, D.C., not slavery itself, but the slave trade be abolished, because they thought that was an affront to American institutions to have this grotesque and embarrassing sale of humans being highly visible from virtually the steps of the Capitol. In addition to that, the Texas-New Mexico boundary border dispute was resolved, with Texas getting paid by the national government to give up some of its land, which Southerners were demanding, because if Texas kept the land, it was slave land, and if they gave it up, it may or may not be slave land. So Texas got paid off, And then lastly, in addition to California's admission as a free state, the last element of the Compromise of 1850 was the creation of a new policy called, well, which actually later would be called popular sovereignty, which meant that the vast regions of Utah and New Mexico Territory, these were the bulk of the lands taken from Mexico in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, that those territories would come into the Union free or slave, depending on what they requested when they sent forward a statehood bill to Congress. And this was, in a sense, the key to the compromise because it allowed both Northerners and Southerners to hope for an auspicious territorial outcome, that Southerners hoped slavery could go into those territories, Northerners hoped freedom would go into those territories. Neither could be certain, but they agreed to live with the uncertainty. So California comes into the Union as a free state, but not without great difficulty because slavery was getting again into the gears of the federal government's kind of disputation of slavery itself.
So, does the death of Zachary Taylor and the rise to the presidency, or the assumption of the presidency of Millard Fillmore, is that affected the compromise itself? I know that Millard Fillmore, being the vice president, would have been part of some of those, maybe not as a participant, but would have heard many of those discussions leading up to that. Did that have any impact on the passage of the compromise or the agreement?
It absolutely did. Zachary Taylor was an unusual figure. He's one of my sort of unsung heroes because he was a large slaveholder that proved to be anti-slavery. And that was absolutely shocking to the Southerners who assumed that he would defend their interests. And no one quite knew because he was one of these generals like Washington and Jackson who was elevated into the presidency largely because of his martial heroics in the Mexican-American War. So he didn't really take positions. He hadn't been very politically active, but he gets run by the Whig Party, and they're hoping to, use him to vault into power, and they succeed. He's elected, and he's facing this issue of what to do over the territorial imbroglio, which had actually been ongoing since 1846, not even preceding the territorial, the treaty with Mexico in 1848. So he knows this is a problem, and he proposes at the outset a free state solution, which absolutely floored Southern congressmen. They couldn't believe it. Southern Whigs were enraged. They stormed out of his office when they realized they had a large slaveholding planter who was proposing the future of freedom for the United States. So they fought him intensively, and his death, in a sense, helped open the door for a compromise because Millard Fillmore from New York turned out to be more flexible. And Fillmore let Stephen A. Douglas do his thing in Congress. Douglas led the move in the Senate to get bills passed to sort of set the stage for the House of Representatives to try and push the same bills through, which was much more difficult in the House because there were more anti-slavery legislators there because the North had more population than the South. So naturally, the anti-slavery views of Northerners had a larger representation there. But Fillmore used his power to help Douglas get the critical votes that he needed. So, patronage power, promises of office, things like that you can give to congressmen walking out the door. If they're not going to get reelected, don't worry, you can be minister to Portugal for the next 4 years on a very, very cushy salary. These kind of promises helped push the compromise through.
So you mentioned in your book Kenneth Stamp's position regarding the uneasy coexistence between slavery and freedom in the mid-1800s, that it assured political conflict. And often political conflict, in human history, leads to violence. So do those compromises in 20 and 50, could those have erupted into violence at that time?
Yes, I think historians generally think the one in 1820 was much less because there wasn't as much heated public discussion of the issues. It's generally considered to be a little bit more confined to Washington. But by 1850, there had been a lot of hostile exchange, rhetorically for certain, and even on the floors of Congress, threats of violence. And in fact, during the compromise, of 18 or during the congressional debates that led to the compromise, congressmen came armed, some of them to the House and Senate chambers, ready to fight with pistols and knives. So it was very clear the nation was on a sharper edge. And by that time, of course, it was far easier for newspapers and the steam press to get news out from Washington to the broader public rapidly. So it was kind of like today where social media can speed along political debate. It wasn't quite as immediate as it is today, but it was far closer to immediate than it had been in 1820. So, yeah, I think that, one of the reasons Douglas came to such prominence in 1850 was that many people believed that he had pacified a terrible storm, that a typhoon could have thundered across America, and he managed to push it, back into the Caribbean, so to speak, and it didn't ravage the country, whereas that seemed a distinct possibility.
I always looked at that balance of power between the North and the South, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the South always knew because of population they never were going to control the House. That never was going to happen, so they didn't have that power. As long as they had a balance in the Senate, they at least had a check on Northern power. When California enters the Union, even though they got the fugitive slave law, which the North did not like, it upset that balance. And so at that point, the only thing protecting the South politically from, I guess, the will of the North would be the president, who could veto anything that the Congress pushed through. So it became critical for Southern politicians to find someone who is at least sympathetic to their cause, if not pro-slavery, at least anti-slavery, which I think you mentioned that as well. But is that a correct assessment? And so when Lincoln gets elected, I know I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but in characterizing the political power, am I right about that?
In general, you are, although I would add a small caveat. And that is that, ironically, there were a lot of Southerners in California, and they elected what were called dough-face representatives. And that's a term that went back many decades to the early Republic that described Northern representatives who voted for Southern interests.
Right.
And so, ironically, when California comes into the Union and there's theoretically more free state votes in the Senate was not a bastion of free soil power. It remained a bastion of Southern power. And in fact, California senators often voted with the South.
Okay.
And as did a number of other senators from northern states who were Northern Democrats, and Northern Democrats were much more tolerant of slavery than Northern Whigs, with, again, Stephen A. Douglas being a conspicuous example. So it wasn't absolutely as if Southerners in 1850 suddenly were on the wrong end of the stick in Congress all the time. That would not be accurate. More generally, is it true that they saw that representation in the country would be increasingly tipping against them over time? Yes, they were distinctly aware of that and had been for decades. But the massive amounts of immigration that the country saw after the Irish after the Irish potato famine in the mid-1840s made it abundantly clear that the North was going to continue outpacing them. So certainly Southerners saw that of the levers of power, they needed to keep holding the Supreme Court, and they definitely preferred to hold the presidency. And Lincoln's election was particularly alarming because he was at the head of an anti-slavery party, and that was a revolutionary development in American politics. There had never been an explicitly anti-slavery party. What had been the case was that Northern Whigs, for instance, had a strong tendency to vote anti-slavery when slavery issues came into Congress. But that's a completely different thing than an actual party dedicated to destroying slavery. And if you read the Republican Party's national convention platforms, that's what they say. And then Lincoln says in 1858, 2 years before he became the Republican presidential nominee, he says he looks for the ultimate extinction of slavery. And these words, of course, once he's selected, are spread throughout the South by every newspaper imaginable.
So if we look at Illinois in the 1850s, it had grown in population exponentially. And so by 1850s, Illinois has a position that it hadn't before. Can you explain the importance of Illinois in national politics at the time?
Sure. Illinois was important partly because it was growing, but that wasn't quite so significant yet because, of course, you don't get the additional electoral votes as a consequence of your greater population until
the next census.
Yeah,
that's right.
So you don't quite get that yet, but it was really important, along with the other states in the Ohio River Valley, such as Ohio and Indiana, and Pennsylvania is another one of those sort of border states, you might call them, or north of the border states, you might call them. And those states were the ones that in 1856 had not gone for the Republican Party, because in 1856, the Republican Party first coalesces, promotes an anti-slavery mission, and runs a presidential candidate, John Fremont. And Fremont is extremely successful. He wins almost all the northern states, but he doesn't win this lower tier of northern states. And the Republicans realize after that election that they don't need any southern states. They've got enough votes that, in the Electoral College, that if they clear all the northern states, they take the presidency. And this, of course, exactly was what you were referring to previously, that Southerners were terrified of.
Right.
So Illinois is in this, a small number of northern states that held the balance of power if Republicans could turn them. And that, of course, makes both Lincoln and Douglas even more significant than they were purely through their public profile, because they were representing a state whose electoral votes were really important.
So Illinois does have prominent politicians, especially Stephen Douglas, but to a lesser degree, Abraham Lincoln. He doesn't necessarily yet have that national appeal, but he certainly has power in Illinois, at least in the formation of the Republican Party. So I mentioned that speech he gives in Peoria, and what he's really angry about is the Kansas Nebraska Act. Can you give a little overview of the Kansas Nebraska Act and Stephen Douglas's position?
Sure. So the Kansas Nebraska Act was the brainchild of Stephen Douglas. He really wanted to organize the Louisiana Purchase territories, and he had to organize them in order to send a railroad, a transcontinental railroad, through them all the way to the West Coast, whether the terminus was San Francisco or some other point. Because you couldn't have land sales, which is how the government dispensed with the land, until the territory existed. So you organize the territories, you organize the land, you sell the land, and then people can settle on the land, and railroad companies, if they get land grants, can build rail lines through the territories across the country.
I always thought about Stephen Douglas, it wasn't just territorial expansion, it was also economic expansion. Is that an accurate assessment of that? Is that as well in Nebraska?
Sure, because, and I think those two things go hand in hand even to this day, because if you control territory, then you control the economic uses of that territory. So that was true then. If you control the land and can send a railroad through it, then you can spur trade, uniting the nation, and you can ultimately extend your reach into markets into the Pacific. So the railroad would enable an enormous increase in a variety of kinds of trade, both domestic and international. So yeah, Douglas is interested in doing that. And of course, the railroad was very fast. So Americans talked of it annihilating space and annihilating time. This is literally a language that they would use because the speed of travel was so much more rapid over land than was remotely possible. We now think of cars being able to rapidly traverse land, but that was not possible either until you had roads that went across the land. So the railroad was very, very fast. He wanted it because it would increase American political and economic might.
With Douglas also, I always felt like he had Illinois at heart too, and in his mind that if you did have a transcontinental railroad and it went through that territory of Nebraska, that the hub would be Chicago. And so then it fosters economic development in his home state. Is that an accurate assessment as well?
Yes, of course, that's always debated because we don't have any document that I'm aware of that says that was actually his motive. But he does own a lot of land in Chicago, right along the railroad tracks. But we should remember there were multiple possible routes for the railroad, and Southerners wanted routes. There were people north of Chicago that wanted routes.
Right.
Douglas owned some of that land as well.
Okay.
So he certainly was interested in covering his bases. But I guess I would say this. I do think I'm a little resistant to looking at the Kansas Nebraska Act as a railroad scheme, which was an interpretation 100 years ago that was promulgated by a prominent historian. I do think he had broader goals in mind nationally.
More
because
national
he was
goals.
A supreme nationalist. I do think that. And there were bigger issues at stake than simply him being able to capitalize on his land purchases. So I think that's his goal. And then, but by the way, he'd been trying to do this for a decade, well before he'd settled in Chicago or owned that land.
Okay.
So he had long wanted national expansion. He is certainly one of the greatest national expansionists in American history. Just throughout his entire career, he's always talking about it. Even in the 1860 election, when Southerners are about to leave, he's talking about it. You read his speeches. So he never stops talking about that. So he cares a lot about that. He wants America to control land. He has a nationalist vision. I would never describe him as a sort of local politician. He was in no way ever a local politician.
You're definitely, I would agree with that. And so there's no
he's got
question.
A national vision. But here's his problem. The Southerners don't want these territories organized because even though they realize that there's northern citizens or northern settlers that want to pour from states like Illinois that are filling up by the 1860s, the federal land sales are mostly exhausted. They want the cheap land out west. So there is a political pressure for politicians to organize that territory, and Douglas is responding to that. But Southerners feel like, hey, if we have the political power to stop this, then we can delay the creation of these new free states, which we don't want, creating new free state representatives in the Senate and the House. And so they do. They basically keep blocking these bills for years, including in 1853 when Douglas gets a bill finally up and considered by Congress, which he'd never even been able to get done before. And he knows at the conclusion of that congressional session that something's got to give if he's going to get the votes he needs to get it through. And ultimately what he does is proposes a popular sovereignty policy that he says is consistent with the 1850 compromise measures, the same laws that organized New Mexico and Utah territories, he says should be applied to the Mexican cession lands, to the Louisiana Purchase lands. And he says, this is what we should do. We should get rid of that anti-slavery provision from the Missouri Compromise. Now, granted, he does not say this publicly. He simply says, here's a law and we're going to vote on it. It's the anti-slavery people say, whoa, you've got to be kidding me. This new language de facto invalidates the anti-slavery provision. And then eventually he's forced into a more explicit repeal. So he kind of wanted to do it quietly. That didn't work out. He had to do it explicitly, but he does do it. And he says when he does it that this is the best policy. This is the policy of the founders. We need to let democracy work. And probably he thought that free soil was going to predominate, but he makes it clear that he had no issue in any territory where pro-slavery settlers want slavery, they can have it. No problem. He doesn't care whether it's voted up or down. So that's really the nub of the Kansas Nebraska Act. And if it was a railroad speculation, it certainly turned into something way, way bigger very fast.
No question about that. And actually, he always seems like so pragmatic. He's always looking for what works. He knows that the South, it's going to be very difficult to gain any support for the Kansas Nebraska Act unless he does something that at least gives them the ability to have an additional slave state. And in fact, it was the Nebraska territory. It wasn't even the Kansas territory. Isn't that correct? And then it's like split in half just for that possibility?
I wouldn't describe that as exactly correct. So you're right. The first bill was a Nebraska bill, and he'd been introducing Nebraska bills for a long time. So the Kansas Nebraska Act, which was at the end of this half-year struggle, and again, it was a brutal struggle, one of these great congressional struggles. The Kansas Nebraska Act reflected the fact that he revises the bill, and the bill ends up creating two new territories, not one. So Kansas Territory, which was south of Nebraska Territory, and anti-slavery senators, congressmen, and the public at large were horrified by this because they presumed that the Kansas Territory was destined to be a slave state because it lay west of Missouri, a slave state. So they just saw Missouri's population spilling over into eastern Kansas, which had a similar similar kind of flora and fauna. So slave agriculture, at least in eastern Kansas, theoretically should have been successful. And so that was horrifying to them. I was like, wow, not only is he striking down the anti-slavery provision, but now he's making it possible for slavery immediately to go into one of these states. Whether that was actually the case is debatable. We don't know precisely why the bill got divided in that way. Probably the scholarly consensus is that it had to do more with railroad speculation and competing interests in Iowa and Missouri over that issue than it did over slavery. But some of these details, they're very hard to pull out of the records that remain, which of course is a common problem for historians. We're like detectives, but the crime occurred, 150 years ago, or sometimes 1,000 years ago. So you work with what you've got, and it's never usually quite as much as you would like.
So we have Douglas's vision of America, and I think you're absolutely right. I think he's a nationalist. He's not tied to something he can gain on some short term because of railroad speculation, although he did buy and sell land, but that's not his main goal. Territorial economic expansion of the country, that's his vision. I think that's pretty clear. How about Lincoln's view? What's his vision of America?
Well, Lincoln's vision is radically altered because of the Kansas Nebraska Act.
Okay.
Lincoln he says later, it roused me, from, a state of torpor, essentially. He doesn't use that language, but effectively, he thinks the nation is in peril. And he believes the nation is in peril because he thinks its founding ideals are in danger of being eradicated.
Can I add something, Dr. Peck? I think for Lincoln, and to me, it's not just the nation's in peril, but democracy's in peril.
Well, I agree with that. I think they go together. So he sees the nation as being the carrier of democracy.
Okay.
And that's why as president, he'll talk about preserving democracy, of, for, and by the people, right? That this is the last best hope of earth, he says. So he looks at this idea of self-government as being encased in the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. Of those two, he thinks the Declaration of Independence is the most important. He says it's, the apple of gold encased, in the frame of silver. The frame is the Constitution. He says a frame is made for the apple, not the apple for the frame. And what does the Declaration of Independence say that's so important? It says that all men were created equal. And that's critical to Lincoln because if it doesn't mean all men, literally, then you've got to decide who's actually equal, who qualifies. And then only those people get self-government. Because the logic of self-government in the Declaration of Independence is that all men have rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And if a government is tyrannical and violates those rights, then the people have the right to overthrow that government. This is the revolutionary principle of the American Revolution.
That sounds Jeffersonian.
Absolutely. Well, right, he pens the Declaration of Independence, so it should. So here's the logic of natural rights. And therefore, the democratic practices established by the American state constitutions, which are the first written constitutions after the Revolution, and then the Articles of Confederation and later the U.S. Constitution, which is our national written constitution, those documents are based on the natural rights dogma. They assume that the people have authorized the powers that those governments now wield. In the words of Gordon Wood, the great historian of the Revolution and the early Republic, that the rulers were now the ruled, that the governing documents limited their powers and put them back into the status of citizens once their terms of office had ended, that they did not have the right to alter those documents and thus enhance their power to become dictators. So this was the critical innovation in American politics that both justified and made possible democracy. So Lincoln sees the nation and democracy as effectively one and the same, unless the Declaration of Independence is repudiated, and with it, what he says is the white man's Charter of Freedom. So he says in the debates with Douglas, we need to be very careful with what we do with the black man, lest in our chase to make a profit of the Negro, we rip up the white man's Charter of Freedom. And what he means by that is, as he says in some of his other musings, he has an unpublished musing where he says, beware of thinking that we can enslave people who are darker in color than us, because by that logic, when you encounter someone who is lighter in color than you, logically he can make you his slave. Beware of deciding that it's intelligence, therefore, that justifies Negro slavery, because as soon as you find a man more intelligent than you, under the yoke you go. So he thinks there needs to be a fundamental bedrock of equality, and that logic then says slavery is wrong. And it was wrong at the founding, but the founders couldn't solve it at that time. It was too difficult, too thorny. They didn't know how to deal with it, so they did the best they could with it, and they made a constitution that did not talk about it and did not justify it and did not authorize the federal government to protect it per se. It left slavery in the hands of the state and did protect, in a sense, the state's domestic institutions from the federal government, but it did not make a pro-slavery federal government. And he said, that's okay. Insofar as that goes, we must maintain that system set up by the founders. What Douglas is doing, though, is radically altering their fundamental view, because he is saying it's fine if territorial settlers want slavery. He doesn't care. He tells us again and again, it's okay if they vote slavery up. And he says it's not okay. It's tyrannical. It's the same principle that kings have used to govern men forever, that the king is superior to them and therefore can take anything he wishes from them. So the divine right of kings establishes a totally different rationale for the power of the government, that God has established the king as the wielder of power to keep order, not natural rights where the people authorize the rulers to take power for a brief period of time under specific conditions that they cannot violate. So Lincoln says this is what's at stake for our nation, and we are about to abandon those revolutionary principles if we let Douglas's doctrine go uncontested.
So you have these two views, and Douglas has a very wide view, as you mentioned. It's national, but Lincoln's even exceeds that, and it leads to the debates in 1858. Can you talk about the impact of the debates on Illinois first, but then the national dialogue on slavery?
Sure. So in Illinois, there is a fascinating innovation. Lincoln had been defeated for the Senate in 1854 because Lyman Trumbull had controlled 5 Democrats who would not vote for Lincoln. And Lincoln ended up handing the senatorship to Lyman Trumbull that the anti-slavery forces had made possible with their successful revolution against Douglas in the 1854 campaign. Because of Lincoln's magnanimity, the Republican organization was determined to make him their only candidate for the Senate in 1858, which was when Douglas's term was expiring. And so at the Republican state convention, they declared that Lincoln was their single and only candidate. No one else would be considered once the state legislature met after the election to elevate someone into the Senate. And in Illinois, as in most states, it was done by the vote of the legislature. It was not a campaign that rested on the votes of the public directly.
Right.
So the fact that Lincoln was identified in this manner was enormously important because it gave him the cachet to go to Douglas and say, I'm your rival. I have a direct stake in this election, and I can ask you to debate with me so that people can make the best decisions on which state representative to vote for. And because of his standing, Douglas accepts these series of debates. Lincoln asked for many, many more than Douglas accepted, but Douglas ultimately said, I'll do 7 of them. Here's the conditions, an hour and a half for each of us, split up into various modalities in different congressional districts in the state and over different months. And we will meet on those occasions, and otherwise we'll get to go our own merry way throughout the 4 or 5 month campaign. And Lincoln agrees to this, and then therefore these became public spectacles where thousands of people were coming from all corners of the region that those debates occurred in to listen to these men speak for 3 hours. Can you imagine that? 3 hours standing in the heat. No one would do that anymore, but they did then. That was a form of entertainment. There was no TV, there was no laptops, there was no streaming video. So
no
the
podcast.
fact that you have these extraordinary spectacles was very exciting. So that's what happens in Illinois. The 2 men face off and battle. Now, nationally, there were some big implications from this debate. And I think one of the biggest was that Douglas ends up getting pitted into a 3 kind of highway contest, sort of 3 political lanes, maybe I should say. He really would have preferred 2 political lanes where it's Democrats versus Republicans, and the Southern and Northern Democrats remain united. But their relations had become very strained, partly because Douglas had fought against the Lecompton Constitution in Kansas, where pro-slavery settlers, through hook and crook mostly, had created a non-representative pro-slavery constitution that the free soil settlers who dominated the population did not want, but they sent it to Congress. I won't explain why. They sent it to Congress, and the Southern senators want to take it up and push it through, and so do the people in the House of Representatives. And the President Buchanan, wanted to do it as well. And Northerners are horrified by this. Douglas knows that if popular sovereignty is abused in this fashion, that it's not the will of the people as is expressed on the ground, then he's going to lose his career. Popular sovereignty is going to be brought into contempt into the North, and the Northern public is absolutely 100% going to vote Republican. So he fights the Lecompton Constitution tooth and nail, votes with the Republicans, and succeeds. They defeat it. Kansas does not get a pro-slavery constitution. It does not enter the Union. It won't for a while. And yet a huge rupture, of course, emerges between Douglas and Southern Democrats.
So is Lincoln,
in the debate, that rupture expands.
Is Lincoln paying attention to that? So he knows the political environment. He knows Douglas's position on Lecompton, and then he uses that to leverage something against Douglas in the debates?
Yes. So at Freeport, he asked Doug, that Freeport was the second debate. And it's in northern Illinois, which is an anti-slavery location, because the northern half of the state was very anti-slavery. And he asked Douglas, can territorial settlers exclude slavery from the territories, despite the fact that the Taney Court, in the Dred Scott decision, the Supreme Court, has essentially made it illegal, says Congress doesn't have the power to exclude slavery from the territories. And since Congress creates territorial governments, then territorial governments cannot have the power to exclude slavery, because their power comes from Congress. And the Supreme Court says Congress doesn't have the power to exclude slavery from them. So if that's the case, he says, how is your popular sovereignty doctrine going to work? And Douglas answers, as Lincoln knew he would. He says, yes, anti-slavery settlers still can keep slavery out by not passing positive laws protecting slavery. So if slaves run away and no one will pass laws to make sure that they are recaptured and brought back to the owner, and sheriffs don't care if they run away, then slavery will essentially be impossible to maintain, because it's a system that requires all these laws and protections of property and man. And just like today, how could you keep your car if someone could bash in the window, start it up, fire it off, get it going, drive it off, and no one cares, and no one will go get it for you or report it? Well, how are you going to keep a car? So it's the same kind of problem that slave owners would have if you don't have a system of slave law to protect it. But of course, this is grossly illegal. If the Constitution says you have a right, then the courts and legislators need to protect that right, or it's a meaningless right. So Lincoln says later in the debate, Douglas is the greatest abolitionist of them all after all. He says this, of course, in mock jest. And Douglas responds by saying, if Lincoln can make them believe that, then his political back is broken. If the abolitionists vote for me, he's got no more votes for the Senate. So they had a little amusing back and forth. But that's what Lincoln does to Douglas, is force him to go on record repeatedly in this well-publicized debate that he is still not going to support Southern rights to property in the territories, at least not right now. He does by 1860, but he was afraid of saying that he supported the Dred Scott decision, because if he supported it in full as the court intended it, then the Northern Democrats' political position was totally eroded in the North, and the Republicans take over. And he looks at that as a tragedy that's going to result in disunion. The Southerners are going to probably start a civil war. So he has to play every card at his disposal to prevent that. And the card he plays is, well, I respect the Supreme Court. They ruled, yes, they ruled that, but they haven't yet ruled that territorial settlers have to pass pro-slavery laws. They haven't said that. So therefore, this is the way out.
Is there any way that Lincoln peers into the future and thinks in 1860 there's going to be another election? 1856, the Republican Party was new, and it still almost won. It came close to winning. It didn't have a complete platform. It was new. The candidate wasn't necessarily that strong, and they still almost won. So is there any way that he's peering into the future and thinking, I could be a candidate for president against Douglas, and I'm going to weaken him here so he's not acceptable to the Southern Democrats? So now he's thinking not only at the senatorial level, but at a presidential level. Am I just reading into that way too far?
That used to be a common interpretation of the Freeport Doctrine, the Freeport debate. And a great Lincoln historian named Don Fehrenbacher strongly disputed it, I think in the 1950s. His book, I think, was published in 1954. I can't remember exactly. But a fantastic book. And he examines in great detail that precise issue and argues that really didn't make a lot of sense. It would be very hard for Lincoln to have maneuvered to that degree to get a nomination to the presidency that was very difficult to get 2 years later.
Right, he didn't even.
Was the byproduct, and was a byproduct of 2 more years of work, where he slowly leverages the publicity that he received. So that was the big thing that actually happened, is that even though he lost, he became a national political figure, sort of on the outskirts, but kind of like right now. Is Rice going to become the vice presidential candidate for Biden, or is it going to be Kamala Harris, or is it going to be someone else? They're on the fringes, like they disappear entirely if they're not selected for the position. But wow, one of them is suddenly going to be big time very, very shortly, and could end up being our next president if anything happens to Biden, or he has one term. So it can be a very small turn of the switch to go from being someone with prominence nationally, where they've got name recognition, to literally being the man or the woman, as it now may be the case in America. And that was really Lincoln's position after the debate. He was in the conversation.
Okay.
And I think that he then leverages that over the next 2 years, and he is aware that he maybe could be selected, but he was still a dark horse. Wasn't by no means guaranteed that he would be the person selected in Chicago at the Republican convention.
Yeah, no way.
But it does play out that way.
Yep. He has to know that it's going to hurt Douglas, though.
Yes. I think that that's true. Whether that's his central goal, I don't know. I mean, I think his central goal was trying to beat Douglas in Illinois. He wants to get elected to the Senate.
Makes sense.
He wants to break Douglas's political power. So I don't think his central goal is to sort of weaken Douglas against the South. Although you are very right. He's aware of this. He says after the debate, it'll be very shortly. It won't take long, he says, before that pill of sectionalism that Douglas has been crowding down the throats of Republicans will be crowded down his own throat. And, of course, Lincoln was correct in this.
So this idea of an irrepressible conflict, does Lincoln buy into this idea? Or does he think that through a series of, I know that he was a great admirer of Henry Clay and compromises, does he think that the nation can continue to go through these series of compromises and exist leading up to the election, before secession. Does he think that can happen into the future, or does he think that eventually this is going to erupt in some sort of much larger conflict?
Well, William Seward, who articulates this irrepressible conflict idea, did not himself think that it would lead to civil war. So we have to distinguish between an irrepressible conflict between slavery and freedom that needed a resolution and a conflict that would result in a shooting war, which is two different things.
So it's a political conflict that needs to be solved, but it doesn't necessarily have to lead to disunion.
Yes, and that is actually where I think Lincoln is in 1858. He says this at the inception of the debate in his House Divided speech, which is a speech that he gives at the Republican State Convention. And he says, we are a house divided, and the house is going to become either all one thing or all the other. It's going to be all slave or all free. So he strikes out that this middle ground can be a long-term solution where the country is divided. Douglas is going to reject that. He's going to say, no, there's no reason we can't remain divided indefinitely into the future. So Lincoln says it's got to be one or the other, and Douglas says that's going to lead to civil war if you're right about that. But Lincoln says, no. What I mean is that the crisis is going to reach a resolution, and once we reach the resolution, it will pass. So he says, I do not think the house will fall, but I do think it will cease to be divided. That's his language from the speech. So he posits this conflict that Republicans and Northerners must meet at the threshold, lest the country's ideals be destroyed, but with the very positive spin that once we meet it, they're going to back down in the South and we're going to get our way. So it's a very neat political trick where he says, look, we got to take a hard line until the election, but then once I'm elected, we're going to be good to go. Well, he says that in 1860. In 1858, of course, he wasn't running for the presidency, but that's his idea in general, that whoever was elected, once the Republicans elected, once we have anti-slavery policies that's predominating in a party that's going to push for them at the national level, that this issue is going to go away. And on that point, Douglas had a clearer vision than Lincoln. Douglas didn't believe that. He thought that disunion was the likely result of Republicans winning on an anti-slavery platform.
He had much more contact with those Southerners, so he knew what they really felt. I know that Lincoln put Douglas in a bad position at Freeport, but Douglas could put Lincoln in a difficult position during those debates too. Can you discuss how Douglas puts Lincoln in a tough position politically in the debates?
Yeah, I think there's two ways he does it. One is the one I've just mentioned, by basically saying Lincoln is a radical and essentially an abolitionist, and his doctrines are going to rend the Union and embroil everyone in a massive civil war. So that's a pretty scary proposition. So that's definitely a way he puts Lincoln on the defensive, and he does so right in the wake of the House Divided speech. To Douglas, the House Divided speech is a clarion call for war, so he pounces on Lincoln because Douglas was a great politician, and he seizes that advantage right away. The other way he puts Lincoln in a bad spot is to say Lincoln's propounding Negro equality, he says. He keeps pontificating on the Declaration of Independence. He says the Negroes are our equal. And he says, I deny absolutely that the Negroes are any kin to me whatsoever. And he says this again and again and again, both in the debate and on the stump throughout the state when he's giving many other addresses. So he says, look, we need, as a white society, to make sure we erect boundaries against black equality. Because if we concede that God's given them natural rights to equality, then he says, how is Lincoln and how are the Republicans generally going to say that they have rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but they don't have rights to be voters? They don't have rights, to be on juries. They don't have rights to go to school, which they can't in Illinois. They pay taxes, but they're excluded from most social services. There's extreme black laws in the state. What's to stop them from expecting to intermarry with whites? There will be all of these horrendous consequences, he says, if the Lincolnian doctrine is followed. And here again, it's very, very interesting. Who was right about that? Stephen A. Douglas, because Lincoln and the Republicans responded, no. Don't argue us into full equality. Lincoln says that's like, calling a chestnut horse a horse chestnut. There's a specious arrangement of words. We're acknowledging what the founder said in the Declaration, that everyone has natural rights that are equal, but that's different than equal social, civil, and political rights. Those have to be adjudicated by a political community. So they don't want to get into that debate because they know most Northerners are very, very racist and don't wish to have a society of blacks and whites being equal. And yet, of course, Douglas was correct, because the logic of equality has taken just the path that he said it would, that the people who have been left out of the American experiment have constantly been banging on that door, quoting Jefferson and saying, let us in. It's our country too. And we're seeing that even right now, I think, with the Black Lives Matter movement. It's obviously been building for some time, but there is a demand that the door needs to be opened yet again.
Does Douglas even try to scare voters and say there's going to be this massive migration of freed slaves into the North? And is that an actual prediction of the Great Migration that occurred decades later?
I agree with the first, absolutely. He definitely tells Illinoisans you have something to worry about. If 4 million slaves are freed and Lincoln gets his way, then why do you think they're going to remain in the South if they can come up north to get better employment? Some of them will clearly come up here. So he definitely says that. I'm chary, on the other hand, of suggesting that he could see 60 years into the future and predict, a great migration that was predicated on a variety of push and pull factors that occurred in the early 20th century. So, I think he was more generally recognizing the realities that would exist on the ground if you take away a system of slavery that prevented people from going where they wanted to go, which is one of the great freedoms we don't think much about, but is one of the freedoms this country gives us if we're free.
So we'll give Douglas credit, but not quite that much credit. So leading up to the election of 1860, and you mentioned the election of 1856, and I referenced it as well, where the Republicans are pretty successful for a brand new party. In 1860, the alignment politically is in favor of the Republicans. Stephen Douglas knows this as well. So what's Stephen Douglas's actions leading up to the election? Because I know he becomes the very first presidential candidate, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but to openly campaign for the position. And then what happens after the election of 1860 when he sees the disunion?
No, you're right. He is the first campaigner. There's a book by that title, Stephen A. Douglas, The First Campaigner. He campaigns because he was terrified by the prospect of disunion. And he goes on a tour of the South after he realizes in the fall that Lincoln is going to be elected. And this was apparent because there were all sorts of elections in antebellum America. The elections weren't all standardized and on the same dates across the country. So there had been elections in the preceding months that showed how the swing states were going to vote. And so he knows Lincoln's going to win. And he goes on a tour of the South, and he says to them, look, I will protect your constitutional rights. I'll use all of my power as an influential Northern senator to vote with you and to prevent the Republican Party from doing anything unconstitutional. The interesting thing is that he is asked, well, are you going to support us when we leave this union? And he says, no, I will not. He says the election of any man to the presidency under the Constitution is no justification for, secession from this union. That's very close to his language. And he says this in a place where there were threats against his life. It was dangerous. I mean, Southerners had driven out anti-slavery orators going way back into the 1830s, 1840s. Those people had been forced out of the South. There was not much free speech. So this was a very brave thing for him to do on a public stand. There's just one of them. He's not backed by a military, but he says it, and he says it repeatedly. So his nationalism shows through, his courage shows through, his patriotism shows through, and the dividing line for Douglas showed through, that I will support you to the teeth, on your constitutional rights to maintain slavery in the states, provided you stay in the Union. You try and destroy this Union, and I'll turn all my political power against you. And that is exactly what he does after Fort Sumter. He goes to Lincoln. He speaks with Lincoln in the White House, and Lincoln says, "Look, keep the Northern Democrats in the Union. Go to these lower North states, the Ohio River Valley states that have all these transplanted Southerners that have relations in states like Kentucky and Tennessee and Virginia, and tell them that they need to sustain this Union, that it's critical that the country be maintained." And Douglas does it in spades. So he takes an immediate tour, and he goes through these states, and he gives one of the greatest speeches of his life in what is now the old state capitol in Springfield, Illinois, called the Protect the Flag speech. And it's a rousing call to Northern Democrats to support the Republican administration, to bury their partisanship in patriotism, is what he says. That the flag must be protected from all foes, domestic or external. It's a great speech, and he tells them, look, this is really hard. We've lost to our much hated and vilified Republican foes who we think are dangerous to the country. But let that not deter us when the country is endangered from the other half of the aisle, from these Southerners who've now taken a knife to the throat of the Constitution. We must rally in the cause of the Union.
And he does all of this
shortly thereafter.
Right. I was going to ask you about that, because he does all of that, and he couldn't possibly have been feeling very well.
And he'd been sick for years, actually. His health had never been great. He was a huge smoker, he was a huge drinker, and a huge eater. So that's not a good combination even now. That's going to put you up for all sorts of diseases. And so he died before he was 50 years old. He was a young man, relatively, from our standpoint. But he traveled up to Chicago. He died in the Tremont Hotel. And his last words when he was asked, what were his last words? He says, to tell my sons to obey the laws and the Constitution of the United States. And that's what's on his tomb in Chicago, at the site of his memorial, on a patch of land that was once part of his estate, Oakenwald, and on the statue that may have a very short life on the grounds of the state capitol, right before you enter the state capitol, at the front entrance. Those same words are on his statue. And of course, that statue, Speaker Madigan has suggested, should be taken down this fall. So Stephen A. Douglas may not have long to look over the city in which he wielded so much power. Maybe we can get the statue and we'll bring him back to Quincy, to his own stomping grounds. If you want him, then so you'll have to see if the people of Quincy want him. That will be an interesting public relations test. I think probably he will be taken down. I know someone has suggested putting up Barack Obama in the same spot, and I think that would be a very worthy replacement in my view if you're going to have one. I will say this, that Douglas himself, by those words, commits himself to agreement with the decision, right? Obey
That's correct.
The laws.
That's correct.
So if the legislators say he needs to go, it's been a century, he's had a good run, then I think Douglas himself would say, fair enough, off I go. And let the people decide. So let the people decide. So I think that that's one way of looking at this that maybe can tamp down the burgeoning concern over the fate of statues in this country. So I just got time for a couple more things, Dr. Peck. Just quickly, we don't have to go into detail, but does the South just believe the North is not going to take any action through secession? Do they think that Lincoln's weak-willed or the North is weak-willed?
they must not fear
Well, it's
war.
hard to know what the entire South thought. There's been huge debates over that in Southern historiography. Historiography is the history of the writing of history, so the debates that historians have to explain the past. And, probably one of the most prominent historians, William Freeling, has argued that it was hard for the secessionists to get their way, just like it was hard for the Republicans to finally emerge and propound an anti-slavery interpretation that Northerners accepted. It was hard for the secessionists to gain enough ground to convince most Southerners that leaving the Union, with all those revolutionary implications, that was a good idea. So he contends that it really took that whole decade of struggle, and not everyone did have the same opinion. And certainly historians have long accepted that idea, that there were Southerners with different attitudes. So there were definitely Southerners like Alexander Stephens who said, this is a bad idea. Even from a pro-slavery perspective, leaving the Union is a really bad idea, because once we're out, we lose the protections of the Constitution and all those Northern Democrats who are going to rally to our cause, like Douglas. We should wait it out. But he's outvoted the people who say, no, we need to strike now. They win. And they want to strike now because they fear the sort of the longue durée, what the famous historian Braudel said, in centuries past, that the longue durée of the influence of geography and population and demography, that was going to be against slavery. And if Southerners were going to get out and try and put up resistance to those forces, they needed to get out of the Union now. And the longer they waited, the fewer chances they would have, because the South was going to be even increasingly outnumbered over time. So that was kind of the logic that was at stake, that now was the time to strike. There'd been a Republican put into office, and if you're finally ever going to get Southerners to unite, you got to do it now. So that's the sort of the best way I'd frame it. I think there was debate among Southerners, but the secessionists finally managed to imprint their position on the Southern political process, and they got their way. And certainly, I suppose, there was a belief that they could win or would win, or there would have been more resistance. But we have to remember, Northerners thought that too. No one thought, as Lincoln said in the second inaugural, that the Civil War was going to be what it became, a brutal, 4-year, monstrous, ugly, bloody struggle that would transform the nation. The Mexican-American War had been a relative lark, and this more romantic idea of war, that we whip our enemy, goes nicely, we get our way and move on, that was a precedent that had only been about a decade past, and I think it influenced people's understanding of what was coming. And so, to ask me to draw direct lines between that kind of idea of war and the confidence that Southerners had, at least some Southerners had, that they could win, it is hard to prove these sorts of relationships in history. But I do think that those ideas were widespread. And after all, Lincoln doesn't even ask for volunteers for a very long period. When he initially asked for volunteers,
90 days, I think.
It took a while for Lincoln to understand, no, this is going to be a long, bloody process.
So the final question I have, Dr. Peck, is what responsibility do you think Lincoln bears for not compromising after the election of 1860 and the secession of the southern states, or at least 7 of them?
I don't think he bears any, really. The fact is that he wasn't elected on an unconstitutional basis, which even Douglas acknowledged. And what he said in response to the same question was that we can't give up the principle that is at the basis of our political party. We've now spent 6 years building a political party at great effort, and we've won on that basis. That's what the democratic system is designed to do. There's been a change in public sentiment, and the majority, as determined by the constitutional process, has put this new party in power. I represent that party. I cannot betray the party by immediately going to Washington or even doing it from Springfield, because he was actually put under this pressure before he took the inaugural oath, and he was being asked by Republicans what to do. And he wrote back, "Hold as with a chain of steel. The tug has got to come, and better now than later." Those are his exact words. So he tells them you cannot compromise on the issue of slavery's expansion. That's the core to our political party. On subsidiary issues, sure, I'm open to discussion, but not on that. And without that, there was no way to get a compromise during what historians call the secession winter, the period of time between his election and his inauguration in 1861. So I don't see how he could have done any differently, because he thought about it very carefully. And he said, for me to betray the party is also to betray democracy. It's just as well that we let the Southerners go if we're simply going to let someone put a gun to our head once we're elected, and the gun is coming with a threat that give us our way or we shoot you, or give us our way or we leave the Union, we destroy the nation. You simply can't, permit that kind of blackmail to govern the political process in a democratic society.
And finally, the last thing I have, Dr. Peck, is, does Lincoln have a view that American democracy will eventually spread around the globe? Is that his hope?
Yes. No, there's no question about it, which is partly why he's so passionate about pursuing the ideals of freedom after 1854, because he really believes that the concepts expressed in the Declaration of Independence are fundamental to human freedom. And of course, he's not unusual in this regard. Americans have been saying this for 70 years. So the whole idea of American exceptionalism that we still have with us today, and that people are starting to debate to a greater degree than most of the rest of American history, but are very powerful. Even someone like George Bush trotted them out without any difficulty when he wanted a war in Iraq. Why does he say we should invade Iraq? Because we're going to throw out a tyrannical government and we're going to establish freedom in the Middle East. And then he says it will spread, and this is what America does. This is exactly what Bush said to justify that war, to tell the American people why we should commit to that war. So this concept of American exceptionalism goes all the way back to the founding. Lincoln was by no means unusual in having it, but I think he expressed it in ways that were particularly powerful. One of his quotes, I wish I could give it to you from memory, but I probably can't. It's one of my favorite Lincoln quotes, so I should memorize it. But he says, the founders expressed the ideal not that it could be implemented at that time, but so that it could spread throughout societies over time, with each subsequent generation having the responsibility and the opportunity to implement the ideas better and better and better. It's an ideal to be realized, never to be perfectly achieved, but to be approximated to a greater degree as time unfolds. So that's on record, just in much more eloquent language than I put forward right there. But he says that because he believed that, and that's why in the 1860s he would more explicitly talk about the implications of the Civil War for the global community.
What an excellent lesson for all of us to remember as Americans. I want to thank our guest today, Dr. Graham Peck, for the great discussion. You can find more about Dr. Peck's work by going to civilwarprof.com. That's civilwarprof.com, all one word. If you'd like to buy his book, Making an Anti-Slavery Nation, Lincoln, Douglas, and the Battle Over Freedom, it's available on Amazon and the University of Illinois Press, which is also accessible on civilwarprof.com. Remember to subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your entertainment, and leave a review for your chance to win a gift card, which I had mentioned earlier. The music today was provided by the band Bones Fork, which is available on iTunes, Amazon, Spotify, pretty much wherever you download your music. And join us again next time when we talk, think, and drink on History A Go-Go.